Verse 13. Now, last week we noticed that Samuel was told by the Lord, verse 10, to go and confront Saul. Now, Saul had been given very clear instructions. Go to the Amalekites and do what? Utterly destroy them. It's just straightforward as it can possibly be. But what did Saul do? Save the king alive. Best of the sheep and the oxen. So, not exactly what the Lord had instructed him to do. So in verse 13, Samuel went to Saul, and Saul said to him, "Blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." And Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen which I hear?" I mean, it was just patently obvious that Saul had not done what he had been instructed to do. And so Samuel's question to him was obvious. Why are you saying this when we both know it's just not true? And so he's confronting Saul with his sin. What did Saul immediately do? How did he respond once he realized Samuel wasn't going to let him get away with claiming obedience when clearly he had not achieved obedience? Blamed the people, didn't he? Yeah, they spared the best of the sheep and the oxen. What was wrong primarily with that answer? I mean, did the people probably want the best of the sheep and the oxen? Probably. But what's wrong with that answer? Okay, he's captain, isn't he? So if the captain of God's people is speaking this way, he's clearly not accepting responsibility. I want to take a moment. I just wanted to kind of introduce a subject with you, a topic tonight, just using this verse as a basis for our study, and really just kind of explore out loud with you something that maybe you have contemplated yourself, maybe you're struggling with yourself at the moment. But why do men sin? Why do we do wrong? You remember when God confronted Adam and Eve? "Adam," he asked, "where are you?" And Adam, of course, was hiding. And God said, "Why were you hiding? And then who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which I instructed you not to eat from?" Those were clear instructions. What did Adam say to God? "The woman that you gave me." That's like a double excuse, isn't it? First of all, I couldn't say no to this woman, but I wouldn't have this woman to say no to or not say no to, because had you not given her to me, I wouldn't have this problem. So now he's blaming God, and he's blaming his wife. And so when God turned to Eve and he said, "What have you done?" Eve said, "Well, I made a really bad choice." What did she say? The serpent did what? The serpent deceived me. And when Moses came down from the mountain, and he met Joshua somewhere in that trek back from the top of the mountain with the Ten Commandments, Joshua said, "I hear the sound of war in the camp." Moses realized it wasn't the sound of war that they were hearing. They were partying. That's what idolatry was, by the way. That's what was so attractive about idolatry. It was just a wild party atmosphere. People were getting drunk and performing all kinds of horrible, lascivious things among themselves. And Moses knew this was going on. And Moses came into the camp, saw what was going on, and he broke all 10 commandments immediately, threw them on the ground and broke them all into pieces. And of course, he ground the golden calf into powder, made them all drink from it. But he confronted his brother. And he asked Aaron, "What have you done?" Remember what Aaron said about the golden calf? The people wanted it. But that's not the worst of it. What else did Aaron say? "I took the golden earrings and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." Moses probably wanted to haul off and punch him in the face. What kind of answer is that? You're seriously going to tell me with a straight face you just threw the stuff in the fire and out popped this calf? Saul is confronted similarly. What is this bleating of the sheep, lowing the oxen that I hear? Well, the people wanted to spare them to serve God. One of the most pervasive false doctrines that, when I say pervasive, it's everywhere. It infects the minds of people everywhere. And it's a doctrine that we generally speak of in the theological world as Calvinism. Calvinism, of course, is just an expression, a term meaning the teaching or the ideas espoused by John Calvin, the 16th century reformer. And of course, I would like to discuss Calvinism with you tonight briefly, but before I do, I want to give you some insight into who it was that had influenced greatly John Calvin in his thinking and his theology. Going back to the 4th century A.D., there was a man by the name of Augustine who had been a pagan priest and was, quote unquote, converted to Christianity. And after being converted to Christianity, embracing a new life in Christ, he continued to struggle with a lot of things. And we're familiar with his struggle because he wrote about it extensively. He was very blunt about the things he struggled with. Most of it was very twisted. Most of it would probably be the kind of thing that we would expect from our lawmakers, maybe from some people in the news media, people of that ilk, maybe some entertainers that recently have had to either resign or be forced out of office or have been fired because of their bad behavior. But that was Augustine, and I'm not making that up. He said this of himself. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because in his Confessions, he was struggling with trying to understand why he's having that struggle. Why am I thus? Why am I struggling with feelings that I know are unholy, they're not right, they're ungodly, they're perverse, they're twisted, they're unnatural, whatever you want to call it, and I don't seem to be able to get a handle on it. I can't stop dealing with it. And so how do I explain it? There was a debate that took place between Augustine and a man by the name of Pelagius. Pelagius took a view that for his day and time was not very popular. But I happen to agree primarily, not altogether, but primarily with Pelagius. Pelagius said the reason you have these perverted thoughts is because you are a pervert, because you have embraced perversion. And of course, he was labeled a heretic and was driven out of town, basically. And I'm paraphrasing, I know I'm just kind of cutting to the chase, but Augustine came up with this fanciful argument. And basically it was that human beings are born with a diminished capacity. In other words, when Adam and Eve committed sin, something happened to them. Their bodies were transformed in some way, some fashion, and so that when they had offspring, their offspring would be born with a tendency toward these kinds of unholy, unnatural, perverse, bad things. And so that's how Augustine dealt with it. And because of Augustine's thinking, and because he won the debate, it's a popular idea. If you stop and think about it, it's rather convenient, isn't it? It's not my fault. I was born this way. So his idea really took hold around the Mediterranean basin and permeated from Rome, and it just spread throughout the world. And so eventually people bought into this idea, and so we go from deathbed conversions where people were waiting till they almost died to be baptized, because there was the view at that time in the early days of Christianity that once you're baptized, if you ever committed another sin, well, then there was no remedy for that sin. So you waited until you're almost dead and then someone would baptize you. It's been suggested this is why, what's his name? The guy, the emperor that was baptized on his deathbed. I'm drawing a blank. Who am I trying to think about here? Come on, somebody hit. Who? The Roman Emperor. The Roman Emperor, which was? No, not Nero. He was 4th century. Caesar. No, they were all Caesars. Who am I thinking about now? Yes, Google it, please. He waited till he was baptized. In fact, do what? Constantine, thank you. Is what you said? But you're not normal. I didn't hear you. So, okay, so Constantine waited until he was almost dead. And Jewel Miller mentioned that in the Jewel Miller film strips. Well, the Jewel Miller videotape now, or CD, or DVD, whatever you call it. But he mentioned that he waited until he was almost dead and he was baptized. He said, well, why did he do that? Well, that was a popular practice until Augustine came along and convinced everyone you're born a sinner. He didn't say it exactly that way. He didn't say what Calvin would later say, but he planted that seed. He planted the idea. We're born with a sinful nature, a diminished capacity to do right or to make right choices or whatever. And so a practice began not long around after his time where babies were being baptized, because the idea soon began to be cemented in people's minds. Well, if you're born that way, it must mean you're born inheriting sin, not just the practice and the tendency, but the guilt itself. And so they started baptizing. So it went from one end of the spectrum to the other end. Wait until your deathbed, but now we're baptizing babies. And of course, that practice took hold, and it predominated in Europe up until the 16th century. And of course, John Calvin advocated infant baptism. Martin Luther advocated infant baptism. Anyone that didn't advocate that was put to death in horrible fashion. The Anabaptists, as they were called, were people that changed that practice. I know I'm getting sidetracked, but my point is, a lot of these doctrines that you hear about, these crazy, bizarre things, come from the very topic that I'm discussing with you tonight. Why do people do wrong things? Why do you have bad thoughts? Why do you do wrong things in your life? Well, John Calvin in the 16th century picked up on Augustine's idea. Again, it was a very, cemented idea in the minds of most theologians at that time. And he carried it to a ridiculous extreme. And of course, Calvin said that we're born altogether sinners and totally incapable of doing any good. And the only way you can ever possibly do good is if God has chosen you before the foundation of the world to be a good person. And there's very few good people, and God chose you to be a good person. And if he didn't choose you, then he chose you to be a bad person. And so he came up with the elect and then the damned, and you have both the elect and the damned, and there's a number that can't be changed or altered. And this was Calvin's view, and that view persists to this day. One of the offshoots of Calvinism, of course, is once saved, always saved, that doctrine that's, again, very popular because it's comforting. I can just accept Christ in whatever way I want to choose to accept Christ, and then I'm good to go. I punch my ticket, and it doesn't matter what happens from here on out, I'm going to be ready to go. So again, it's a very popular idea. It's a lie, satanic lie, but nevertheless, all of this comes from this question that I'm raising tonight. Why do we do wrong? Now you say, well, theologians are not the only ones to deal with it. Indeed, they're not. It's routine nowadays to hear about geneticists telling us that pedophiles are pedophile because they were born with some kind of pedophile gene, or murderers are murdered because they're born with some murderous gene, or alcoholics or drunks were born with some kind of alcoholic or drunk gene, or homosexuals, or those who practice bestiality, or those who want to be politicians. Anything that's aberrant or evil or immoral or ungodly. Y'all heard that, didn't you? So you're not, I wonder if you're awake, but glad you're awake. But any of these tendencies, we're now tending to blame it on genetics. It's really not my fault. And if it's not genetics, if it's not some theological explanation where Adam sinned and therefore we have a diminished capacity, well then it must be my environment. It's just what Saul was arguing. The people pretty much forced me to do this. The Menendez brothers, you remember when they took a shotgun and shot their parents? You remember what they argued? Does anyone remember that case? Why'd they kill their parents? No, they weren't the Twinkie people. That was somebody else. Do what? No, they didn't get a Mercedes. I think they wanted a car, a particular car, and they didn't get it, and they felt abused and neglected.
It's on right now. They're saying that they were abused their whole life.
Oh, were they abused?
Also,
Ma'am?
They said they were molested by their father.
Oh, they were? That's why they killed him? Okay, well, again, they found a reason, quote unquote, reason for their behavior. And again, you mentioned the Twinkie defense. That's a term used in legal circles, the Twinkie defense. I mean, I know it sounds crazy, but that's actually the term that's used among lawyers, because there was a city manager that was killed in San Francisco by some irate constituent who came in and just shot him one day, and his argument was, I ate too much sweets that morning and I couldn't control myself, and I went into a rage and I killed this man. And so we have now the Twinkie defense. I like what Anna Russell had to say about this, and I want to get back to this in a moment. But Anna Russell, she wrote a psychiatric folk song. And she said, at 3, I had a feeling of ambivalence toward my brothers, and so it follows naturally that I poisoned all my lovers. But now I'm happy. I have learned the lesson this has taught, that everything I do that's wrong is someone else's fault. And so it's a catchy little poem. I can imagine some rapper, rapping with this or whatever. But I mean, this is an interesting way of expressing what I think human beings have been doing since the days of Adam and Eve. And if we're honest with ourselves tonight in this room, and we look at bad choices we've made, wrongs that we do, evil thoughts we entertain, or whatever, we might say, yes, I acknowledge my sin, but I think a lot of times, because it's just so painful to embrace and to accept the reality of your choice, that we too find some scapegoat. We find some rationale, some reason for the wrongs that we commit. And she goes on to say, Anna Russell, she said, it is surely nothing new that men want to get away from acknowledging their sins or even thinking about them. Is this not the religious history of mankind? And that's what we're seeing here tonight. Perhaps we're only more glib nowadays and equipped with more euphemisms. Disease and treatment have been the watchwords of the day, and little is said about selfishness or guilt or the morality gap, and certainly no one talks about sin. You remember Charles Sykes? He wrote that brilliant piece in the Milwaukee magazine where he's talking about this very thing. He says, as it becomes increasingly clear that misbehavior can be redefined as disease, growing numbers of the newly diseased have flocked to groups like Gamblers Anonymous, Pill Addicts Anonymous, S-Anon, that's relatives and friends of sex addicts, Nicotine Anonymous, Youth Emotions Anonymous, Unwed Parents Anonymous, Emotional Health Anonymous, Debtors Anonymous, Workaholics Anonymous, Dual Disorders Anonymous, Batterers Anonymous, Victims Anonymous, Families of Sex Offenders Anonymous. In place of evil, Therapeutic Society has substituted illness. In place of consequence, it urges therapy and understanding. In place of responsibility, it argues for a personality driven by impulses. Celebrities vie with one another, confessing graphic stories of abuse they suffered as children, while television talk show features a parade of victims ranging from overweight incest victims to handicapped sex addicts. Dysfunction is in every aspect a growth industry, from the addicts of the South Bronx to the self-styled emotional roadkills of Manhattan's Upper East Side. The mantra of the victims is the same: I'm not responsible. It's not my fault. He continues, and I'll share this one last thought with you and get back to our question at hand. American life, he said, is increasingly characterized by the plaintive insistence, I am a victim. The national anthem has become the whine. Now enshrined in law and jurisprudence, victimism is reshaping the fabric of society, including employment policies, criminal justice, education, urban politics, and in an increasingly Orwellian emphasis on sensitivity in language, a community of interdependent citizens have been displaced by a society of resentful, competing, and self-interested individuals who have dressed their private annoyances in the garb of victimism. Victimism obviously worked. Now I have a question, because I think I've shared this with you before, but I had a teacher in the school that I attended in Montgomery that shocked me on a number of occasions, but one time I'll never forget, he suggested that we were, as Augustine taught, born with a diminished capacity, that when Adam and Eve sinned, something happened to us. He even said, on a genetic level, perhaps. That's how he worded it. Maybe on some genetic level. And so that when we're born with a tendency to do wrong and bad things. We're just born that way. And that's why we do wrong. And I'll never forget in class, I asked this question. I said, what evil influence other than Satan, who slithered in the form of a serpent, what evil influence was there to be brought to bear in the Garden of Eden? He said, well, other than the serpent, there was no evil influence. I said, was God there? Yes. In fact, God was there bodily, walking in the cool of the day. And Adam and Eve probably had a chance to ask God, why did you make mosquitoes and ticks and earthworms? And they could probably ask God, why did you make these things? But suddenly that was cut off, and they no longer had that access to God. Why? Why did Adam and Eve do what was wrong? And what answer would you give to that? Well, what does the text say in Genesis 3? The serpent slithers up and he says, yea, as God said. And what did Eve say? What did Eve say to him? Well, that's what Satan said. Eve said, we're not supposed to look at it or touch it. For the day we do, we'll surely die. And Satan said, you will not surely die. Okay, and then she did what? Do what? She looked at it, didn't she? And thought, hey, it looks pretty good. It probably was candy coated and it had a big M in the middle of it, I'm guessing. That looks pretty good. And she probably thought, and if I do what Satan suggests, if I just partake of that beautiful, delicious fruit, then I'll be like God. I'll be wise. And my eyes will be open. So I'm going to ask you again, why did she do what she did? What's that? Drawn away of her own lust and enticed. Where did you get that idea?
James chapter 1.
Thank you, James 1. So, did God tempt her? So when you do wrong, why do you do wrong? When I do wrong, why do I do wrong? When I make bad choices, why do I make bad choices? You say, but man, the world is just full of stuff. It's on the radio, it's on television, it's everywhere. Yeah, the serpent's voice is everywhere. That's true. And we can control how much of that voice we're willing to listen to and feed our mind with. Indeed, we are. And the voice of God that was walking in the cool of the day is still walking right here in our midst. And we have that voice and we can still listen. And so the question that we need to ask ourselves every time we do what is wrong, why did I do that wrong thing? Now, when someone says, I can't help but do what I did, what's going to happen on Judgment Day if that's true? If you're born this way and therefore have no responsibility in it, how can God justly judge you? So that every one of us shall give an account of himself to who?
God.
And I'm going to be judged according to what I've done what? In my body. So I'm going to be judged based on the choices that I've made, right? And so when I'm judged, it's just follow this, how we think. This is how we think. Imagine that you're standing before the King of Kings and he says, you did X, Y, and Z in your lifetime. You made these bad choices. And you're going to say, well, yes, Lord, I did, but you just don't know the kind of influence my friends had over me. And you just don't understand what it's like because people were mean to me and I wanted to be accepted. I wanted to be a part of the crowd. I really couldn't help myself. Or, I was in a lot of pain and I just needed to escape the pain and that's why I got hooked on drugs or alcohol or... You just don't understand, Lord. So what do you think the Lord's going to say to us? Well, you're right. You are just flesh. God does acknowledge we are just flesh. He acknowledges that. And we do have weaknesses. And he's very merciful to us, by the way, because he recognizes our weaknesses. But how can God identify with us? He's one of us. He became one of us. And And the Hebrew writer said, how many times did he sin as one of us? Did Satan ever slither up into his life and tempt him?
Oh, yes.
Did Satan ever lie to him? Did he have people that were close to him, that loved him, that betrayed him? That let him down? So, if he had done wrong, who could he blame?
Himself.
So when you do wrong, who can you blame? He didn't do wrong. Now, I know sometimes people hear that and they think, well, he wasn't fully human. That's a lie. And if you deny his humanity, you're denying him. You're denying the great gift that he's granted us. That's Antichrist teaching. You can't argue that he's not one of us. He is one of us. And yet he's without sin, which proves what?
That can't be done.
You don't have to do what you do, but yet we do. The more you think about it, the more you talk about it, it's like the dog chasing his tail. You're like, okay, I know I do wrong, but why can I not stop doing wrong? Who's achieved perfection among us? Anybody? I said, who has achieved perfection?
We should all strive for perfection.
Shouldn't we strive for it? How many of us are there, have arrived? If I'm just sick and therefore not accountable to God, I can't imagine Judgment Day and God impartially judging me. But I do know that Judgment Day is coming and he will be an impartial judge. Therefore, I recognize that I am responsible for my actions. And I think it's this lack of willingness to accept responsibility that is the downfall of our entire culture. And this whole concept of victimization. It's not my fault. I've got this problem. I got that issue. I got whatever. And we're always blaming someone or something for doing wrong things. Of course, Saul eventually confessed to doing wrong. And, of course, verse 27, we looked at this quickly as we were closing class last week. And Samuel turned to go away, and Saul seized the edge of his robe, and it tore. Of course, Samuel said, this is symbolic. It means the kingdom to be torn from you, given to one of your neighbors who's better than you. That's verse 28. But verse 30, he said, I have sinned, yet honor me now, please, before the elders of my people and before Israel. And return with me that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel turned back after Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. So, was Saul genuinely penitent, is the question. Well, it would seem not, based on what we're about to read in the following chapters. And I guess as you look at the whole picture of Saul, it's like he realizes when he's confronted and he can't deny it. I mean, he tries to, but he really can't get out of it. But he's just not embracing what he's done. He's not fully accepting it. Now, verse 32 is interesting. Well, before we get there, I want to share with you a portion of the 51st Psalm to compare and contrast David. Did David do wrong? Did he sin? Grievously, didn't he? But notice how David speaks of himself when he's confronted. Remember, Nathan came to him and told him the story about his rich neighbor, and David was so enraged about the story that he heard. The man that did this will pay fourfold. And Nathan looked at him and said, you're the man. You're the one I'm talking about. And so David wrote a series of penitential psalms. They're beautiful psalms. But the 51st Psalm is really incredible. He said, have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak and blameless when you judge. The King James, I believe, translates a portion of the 51st Psalm, David saying, I was altogether born in sin. I believe that, or is that the NIV that does that?
In sin is my mother conceived.
My sin and my mother conceived me. That's right. The NIV is the one that said, I was altogether born in sin. I think some other modern translations take that view as well, that that's what David said. Understanding that it's Hebrew poetry and that David is using hyperbole, I think is the best way to understand what David was saying there. Altogether in sin did my mother conceive me. When David says, and what he's literally saying there, I just was born sinning. That's what he's literally saying. But he doesn't mean literally in the absolute sense, I was born a sinner, as Calvin argued. He just meant in hyperbolic fashion. I feel so badly about how awful I am as a human being that it's as though I was just born a horrible person. And I think that's all he really is saying. And that's the only way to really understand this Hebrew poetry. I was just born a terrible person. But he doesn't mean by that, as Calvin meant it, as Augustine meant it. He was using poetic license, as we might say, to express deep sense of guilt, overwhelmed with a sense of his own acknowledgement of his sin and his transgression that he had committed. But again, if you look at the language here, it was iniquity, it was evil, it was sin. He didn't parse words. He didn't try to, kind of soften the blow. I'm not really that bad. In fact, it was quite the opposite. I'm just a terrible person. That's how we might summarize. I'm just a horrible person. I don't deserve anything, so I'm just pleading for God to have mercy on me. That's, in essence, what he's saying in all of the penitential psalms, especially Psalm 51. But very different, I think, than the response from Saul, which may indicate what Samuel meant when he said God's looking for someone better than you. It didn't mean that David's going to be a sinless person. It just meant that when he did do wrong, he would recognize, acknowledge that sin and turn from it. Now, verse 32. Samuel is no longer a judge, but he is still a prophet. What's another word you could use for prophet? Preacher, yeah. And I mean, literally, in a sense, that's what he is. He's a preacher. And Samuel said, "Bring Agag, king of the Amalekites, here to me." So Agag came to him cautiously. And Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." And Samuel, the preacher, said, "As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And Samuel, the preacher, hacked Agag in pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. I was telling someone today, what was the title of the sermon I was planning on preaching? Preacher Packing Heat, I think is it. Anyway, I'm trying to figure out a way, to preach a sermon where, the idea is that the preacher might shoot back if you were to shoot at him. But, to use it not in the literal sense, although tragically that kind of thing's happening in churches. But kind of a play on words and toying with the idea. It's a work in progress. Don't judge me. I see the judgment in your eyes. I'm working on it. Just bear with me. But again, this is just amazing to me. I mean, I just can't imagine taking a sword and chopping anybody to pieces, whether he deserved it or not. I mean, that's terrible. Why would he do that? Why would a preacher do that? I mean, kind of puts a different view on preachers, doesn't it?
God told him to.
Well, God told, he told Samuel. Samuel told Saul to do it by God's order, but he didn't do it. But anyway.
It's capital punishment because he had been a murderer himself.
That's right.
And if he shed man's blood by himself, his blood, his blood be shed.
Exactly.
It's capital punishment. Executed.
Verse 35, the latter part of that verse, Samuel went no more to see Saul to the day of his death, and yet he mourned for Saul. And the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Any questions about chapter 15? Or any thoughts about the subject I've been discussing tonight? I'm sure you probably have some thoughts of your own. But Samuel seems pretty depressed at this point, doesn't he? So what is he going to do? He's going to go home to his home, and he's going to sit there and he's going to mourn. And that's what he's doing. So chapter 16, the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I'm sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go if Saul hears that he will kill me?" It's kind of interesting to me because I'm pausing here because I've heard different commentators say different things about what's going on here. When you go back again to chapter 15 where Saul is begging Samuel to come with him, offer sacrifice for me. And at first Samuel's like, I'm not going to do it. And then Saul grabs his cloak and eventually he goes back and has prayer with him and offers a sacrifice for him. I think it was Burton Kaufman who said that Samuel probably acquiesced on that second asking or request on the part of Saul because he was afraid for his own life. Because if he didn't go back, he thought, Saul might just lose his temper and kill me. Well, what we're going to learn about Saul in the coming chapters, that wouldn't be out of the question. In fact, with the priest of Nob, he killed all of them. He had no problem taking out priests or prophets or preachers or whatever you want to call them. That wouldn't have stopped him. And as far as taking out the life of innocent people, he spent the majority of his life trying to kill David out of pure jealousy. So he was that kind of man. And yet, when you look at the exchanges between Samuel and Saul, Samuel didn't back down or cower to Saul ever. He made it very clear, this is the voice of God, and you must listen to the voice of God. And it didn't seem that Samuel didn't seem afraid, and yet the text says here, as he's speaking to God, if I go, he will kill me. And then this is probably going to bother you, and it ought to bother you because it's going to raise a question. It does raise a question for me. I don't know if it raised. Let's say what the Lord said to him. Take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Then invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. You shall anoint for me the one I name to you. Why was Samuel told by God to go to Jesse's house? To do what? Find a new king. And Samuel said, if Saul hears about it, he'll kill me. And God said, tell everybody that you're going there to offer sacrifice. Was it a lie?
No.
Did he offer sacrifice? Indeed he did. So God's simply giving him an explanation. He's not telling him to lie. He's not telling him to withhold. Just, okay, here's a reason for you to go. Go and offer a sacrifice. You ever done anything like that? I have many times, and I've been called a liar for doing it. I'm just saying that sometimes you can go to do something intending to do one thing, but nevertheless, God's telling him. When people ask him, well, I'm going to sacrifice. Well, he did go and sacrifice. And that's what he did. But had he said, I'm going to find a new king, he probably would have killed him before he could have gotten there. So God's given him an out. So again, I think the first instinct is to say, he lied. God's not a liar. God's not going to tell him to lie. So it wasn't a lie. It wasn't deceptive even. It was true. So do you have to always say everything? If you're married, you already know the answer to that question. Verse 4. How long have you had that? Oh, I've had it a long time. Mm-hmm. And what's a long time? 30 minutes? 30 days? Samuel did what the Lord said and went to Bethlehem, and the elders of the town trembled at his coming and said, do you come peaceably? Okay, now I'm sorry I got to stop again because they're asking the preacher who's there to offer sacrifice, are you coming peaceably? Well, what else would he be there to do? Hack somebody to pieces, maybe? I mean, had word gotten around, he might take a sword out and, take you out. I mean, I don't know. That's just, stuff like that is interesting to me. Why would they ask him, do you come peaceably? He said, peaceably I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come. He said exactly what God told him to say, by the way. Come with me to the sacrifice. Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So it was when they came that he looked at Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. Now, why would he say that? Eliab was who? Number one of the sons, right? And he's probably a good-looking, tall fella. And so Samuel sees him and said, this has got to be the one. The Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at what? And in this case, the heart isn't just so much, the seat of affection. It's really your character. It's really the other way of just saying, he's looking at your overall character, the kind of person that you are. What motivates you? What makes you tick? And so God's not looking at the other thing. But now remember what was noted about Saul. The first thing that were said about Saul. Number one, he's from a rich family. Number two, how tall was he? He was the tallest one in Israel. How good looking was he? Nobody surpassed him in good looks. And so he had all of the physical attributes that you would imagine a king is supposed to have. This is the quintessential look of a king. And so Samuel's just following suit. Here's Eliab, it must be him. God said, I'm not looking at that, I'm looking at something far more important. So Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Thus Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen thee. And Samuel said to Jesse, are all the young men here? He said, there remains yet the youngest, and there he is keeping the sheep. Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, with bright eyes, and good looking. And the Lord said, there's got to be another translation here, by the way. Somebody have the English Standard Version? Verse 12. Anyone? Ruddy? That's the English Standard Version? Anybody have another version? No one has redhead? It was a redheaded young man, yeah. He's Jewish redhead. That's interesting. So he's redheaded, he's bright-eyed, good-looking. Brennan. Told you she wasn't normal. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah. So, was David a prophet? Yes. Indeed he was. Was he inspired of God? Indeed he was. Did he write much of Scripture in the Old Testament? Indeed he did. Was he described as a prophet by Peter in the New Testament? Indeed he was. So he was, at this point as a young man, anointed by Samuel, and he became, at this point, in essence, a prophet, and would later become king over all of Israel. Okay, verse 14 through the end of the chapter really is what we might call a parenthesis. It's not really, if you try to put it in the chronological order in which we're reading this, it's not going to work. It's kind of a summary statement looking ahead into the future, looking back. It's just kind of an overview of Saul very quickly. We don't really have time to read it. We'll wait and get into this next. We've got about 1.5 minutes left according to the glare on the clock. So any comments or questions you might have about David or about how God sees things differently than we do? Does God see things differently than we do? Name something that God sees different than we typically do. Anything. Time? That's good. It does. How does God see time? 2 Peter 3? 1 day is with the Lord is, and 1,000 years is, in other words, it's meaningless to him. He's outside of time, by the way. He's not bound by time. We are in space. He's above and beyond time and space. So it doesn't affect him like it does us. If you were 10 years old and you knew that Christmas is 2.5 weeks away, 840 and you're so much, by